Thank you. I'm really delighted to be with you this morning, for the 2 days, as a policy person who spent most of my career in child welfare, not as a researcher. It's fun to sit and talk with you all about the issues around research evidence and its use from a variety of perspectives, but to be able to add mine is really a delight. As I said, I've spent years in the Child Welfare State Agency. My presentation this morning will focus on a particular initiative as a case study to explore the issues that we've been talking about. I should warn you up front that I'm not going to talk a lot about the role of research evidence. I'm going to talk a lot about other kinds of evidence, information, experience, and how to use that in ways that perhaps might mirror research evidence with the ultimate goal of bringing them all together. I'm going to try to move through the early slides because it's really at the end that I want to share some thinking about how to bridge the worlds of policy and research. So I wanted to talk a little bit about just the frame of the role of evidence and the exercise of public stewardship and leadership, and then talk a bit about practice-based evidence. A little bit about evidence-based programs. We had a long conversation yesterday about that, but so I'm going to move through those slides more quickly because we've covered a lot of that ground, but talk a little bit about that, but really focus on this notion of how we continue to build the evidence base through these partnerships. So I think it's helpful just to be explicit about why the use of evidence is important, research evidence and other types, and we referenced yesterday the role of public stewardship, using evidence to make well-informed policy decisions and producing results for and with diverse populations. There's also the notion of public leadership. So as I think in my role as a leader of a system reform, working with other leaders, the role of using the value of evidence that can be explained, articulated very clearly, helps one lead other people through a change. So we don't lead based on gut instinct or, I think I might have an idea, but I can't explain what it is or why I think it. Doesn't really engage and motivate staff through a change process. So I think it's really important to frame that, not only because it frames why evidence is important, but how one uses evidence is important. It's not about having a bright, brilliant person at the top, well informed by evidence, but how you engage people in understanding it, so that they understand why the change is evolving the way it is, and can contribute to the conversation so that they're engaged in that process and can take some ownership of it. So research evidence clearly can help with that, so long as it's available, accessible, and applicable. And we know that those are big words for research evidence. But I think other sources of information and experience can also play that role, so long as those sources are similarly subject to examination. So when we talk about clinical judgment and experience, those can be valuable in the change process, the leadership process, but there's a way of using that evidence, and I use that term broadly, I know, that requires us to be very explicit about what those experiences and those judgments are, so that other people can engage with us and really determine whether we're using it appropriately, whether it really does have bearing on the decision at hand, and can really test our hypothesis about what that kind of information and experience is telling us we ought to do. So this is, I'm just going to walk through fairly quickly a process that we went through when we were designing what we called family networks. So family networks became our name for our service system. It's our the department spends about $300 million a year purchasing services. This is not the Medicaid dollar, this is the social service dollar, on a range of services: in-home, community-based, intensive foster care, congregate care. And it was a very siloed system. All those programs grew up on their own, and we wanted to integrate that system to make it more coherent, to make it more cohesive. And so so that's what Family Networks is that system. I should note, I think that in child welfare, we think a lot about systems more than programs. So we had this conversation yesterday where we were talking about programs, and systems all that messy stuff in which they reside. Well, systems are the life of a child welfare person. So they're in the forefront, and the programs sit within them, but we really think very much in terms of systems. And we think of wicked problems and nested relationships and all those things you know about. So we were really thinking in a very systemic way. So we went through a process of really being very disciplined, transparent, about collecting and synthesizing all sorts of practice-based evidence. These are some of the key focuses. So we looked at residential services. We did a lot of focus groups with our field staff. We had a very intensive conversation about case management decision-making and the roles of public staff versus private staff in that. At every step of the way, we wrote that up. We put it out publicly. We allowed people to examine that practice-based evidence and our synthesis of it, and to test it and talk back with us about whether or not that was making sense to them. And then we moved forward to a design process. Ultimately, this results in requests for proposals, but we went through a very long process of collecting that practice-based evidence, integrating it with our administrative data. You know, child welfare has a very rich administrative data set because of the federal investment in SACWIS systems and the CFSR process, so that was part of what we looked at. But we were always refining and integrating and testing our practice-based evidence and our administrative data to put forward a vision, a design from conceptual to operational to detail, and going through iterative processes of allowing people to test that and challenge us in terms of whether we were interpreting that correctly, applying that correctly, understanding it correctly. And so I think I would submit that practice-based evidence has a place in these conversations, but how one uses it, how one collects it, how one shares it really matters. This is what all those conversations came up with, is basic family networks design. We focused much more on practices. We called them shared roles and responsibilities. That's how we saw the system becoming more integrated. Family team meetings, CANS is an assessment tool that we required of everyone. A web-based information system with service planning, treatment planning, assessments, progress notes, so that was centralized and it became a common platform, and continuous quality improvement. So these are really mechanisms for continuing to collect in a very disciplined way practice-based evidence. So we know that these big practices are not themselves research tested, but we were continuing to use those to collect practice-based evidence. And that was how we really conceptualized how our service system could become more integrated. Shared roles begins to sound a little bit like common elements, but it's a pretty high-level common element. In the conversations that I've heard over the past couple of years, common elements is used at various levels of specificity. And it's very challenging to understand or crosswalk those conversations. Quickly, program development. So we had a long conversation about all the reasons that people become wedded to homegrown. Here they are. I'm not going to recapitulate that conversation. But we did bring in MST. It's not that we shied away from evidence-based programs. We did do it. We were convinced by that. But notice that there was also a process here. The relationships mattered, rigorous and relevant evidence about the program mattered, and local legwork mattered in installing that program. So some of the same dynamics of the process of collecting practice-based evidence were shared in the implementation of the evidence-based program. So here's what I've been actually thinking about much more recently. Bridging. So there are lots of designs for bridging policy and practice and research. And we have intermediaries and we have conferences, and we think a lot about this bridging notion. And I really have started to think much more beyond bridging, in part because sometimes bridges look like this, sometimes they look like that, and sometimes they look like that. And they just are hard to pass, even with good guides. And so what I've begun to think about is partnerships where researchers and policymakers work together to craft relevant research questions still conduct research in a very rigorous way, but I think that the solution for the bridging is actually in partnering. And I am having, and this may be the wonderful experience I had as a WT Grant Fellow, having spent time in a research shop and finding some very common ground. You know, I went there to think about and learn about research findings and their applicability to my world. I was very surprised to find that how researchers conduct their business, their inquiry, how they learn, felt very common and familiar to me. And so I really would suggest that the bridging, the bringing together of research evidence, practice evidence, all of that knowledge creation process is best done through partnerships rather than these bridging and thinking about these two communities on separate sides that occasionally come together, occasionally miss each other, where the research, the practice people might say, I don't think your research is relevant to me, or I don't understand it. We can come together and ask relevant research questions and handle them and explore them in various, very rigorous ways. I think that my hope is that we move from, we think about scaffolding from practice-based evidence and building through a rigorous hierarchy so that we don't just stay at practice-based evidence, but we eventually come to a place where policy folks and practitioners really could engage and support very rigorous, even RCT approaches to the building of the evidence base. But I think that relationship building and that shared knowledge creation is really an important part of the conversations that we've all been having. So, thank you.